tell me it is not her," Cerys whispered. Her voice barely carried over the torrential rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the royal study. She stood in the doorway, the heavy oak doors pushed open, the chill of the storm clinging to her soaked cloak. Alpha King Alaric did not look at her. His jaw clenched, his fiery amber eyes fixed on the embers dying in the massive marble hearth. Beside him, draped over the leather arm of his chair, was Isolde. The golden-haired noblewoman adjusted the collar of Alaric's silk shirt, a triumphant, sickening smile ghosting her perfect lips. "It is complicated, Cerys," Alaric finally muttered. The great Alpha King of the Autumn Crown, a warrior who had conquered the southern territories, was suddenly reduced to a stammering boy by the mere presence of his ex-girlfriend. "No!" Cerys said. The single word was sharp enough to draw blood. She did not scream. She did not fall to her knees weeping. Running implied fear, and crying implied she still valued his heart. Right now, a cold, surgical anger was actively metabolizing the grief in her veins. She reached to her belt and unclasped the heavy gold royal ledger key, the ultimate symbol of the treasury she had built for him, the economic empire she had forged with her own mind over 3 agonizing years. She held it out for a fraction of a second, letting the firelight catch the gold. Then she let it fall. It struck the marble floor with a sharp, piercing chime. It sounded horribly final, echoing down the cavernous, vaulted corridors of the estate. "It is actually very simple," Cerys said, her voice eerily steady. "Goodbye, Alaric." Before he could reach out, before his alpha command could form in his throat, she was gone. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing Cerys from the man she had loved. For a fraction of a second, she expected to hear his heavy boots pounding against the marble, chasing after her. She expected his deep voice to shatter the tension, ordering her to stay. Only the rhythmic drumming of the storm answered her. Cerys walked with a measured, deliberate stride toward the east wing. Her mind, usually occupied with the logistical nightmares of managing Alaric's trade routes, narrowed to a single, burning directive. Leave. She pushed open the door to their shared suite. The scent of him, pine, smoke, and bergamot, hung heavy in the air, suddenly suffocating. She moved to a mahogany wardrobe. She did not take the silk gowns he had bought her for the council galas, nor the diamond-crusted jewelry that marked her as his chosen. She pulled out a simple leather duffel bag and shoved in her oldest, most durable clothes, heavy woolen sweaters, dark riding leathers, and a pair of worn combat boots. "Cerys." She froze. Standing in the doorway was Cale, Alaric's beta, and a man who had become something of a brother to her. His broad shoulders filled the frame, his jovial face pulled tight with concern. "Step aside, Cale," Cerys said, pulling the zipper of the duffel bag closed with a sharp, metallic zip. "I smelled the distress radiating off you from the lower armory," Cale said, stepping cautiously into the room. His eyes darted to the half-empty drawers, then back to her face. "What did he do?" "He brought Isolde back." Cale flinched. The subtle tightening of his jaw and the way his hands curled into fists told Cerys everything she needed to know. "You knew," she breathed, the realization dropping like a stone in her stomach. "Cerys, it is not what you think. The southern packs are rebelling. Isolde's father controls the largest militia on the border. Alaric needed to secure an alliance." "By taking her into his private study?" Cerys interrupted, her tone dropping in temperature. By letting her undress him? Do not insult my intelligence, Kale. A political alliance is forged in the council room wit, ink, and blood. What I just walked in on was forged in the past, and it is a past your king clearly is not over. She slung the bag over her shoulder and marched toward the door. Kale held out a massive hand, blocking her path. He loves you. If you walk out into that storm, you sever the tether. You know the laws of the pack. To leave the territory unannounced is treason. Cerys stepped directly into Kale's personal space, forcing the towering werewolf to look down into her dark, uncompromising eyes. She did not have the physical strength of an alpha, but in that moment, her aura of absolute dignity was more dominant than any wolf's growl. If you try to stop me, Kale, I will scream. I will make such a scene that half the estate will come running, and Alaric will have to explain to his entire guard why the woman he claimed as his equal is fleeing in the dead of night. Do you want to deal with that fallout? Kale held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment. The silence between them was thick with unspoken apologies. Slowly, he lowered his arm. The back service roads are flooding, he murmured, looking away in shame. Take the northern pass. The guards there shift rotations in 20 minutes. There is a blind spot. Thank you. Cerys slipped past him, descending the servants' staircase into the damp, echoing underbelly of the palace. She found her old, rusted Land Rover, the vehicle she had arrived in 3 years ago, waiting in the subterranean garage. The engine sputtered in protest before roaring to life, a gritty, mechanical growl that drowned out the pounding of her heart. She drove out into the blinding sheets of rain, her tires kicking up gravel. She glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The highest window of the estate was illuminated. A silhouette stood there, hands pressed against the glass. Alaric. Cerys shifted into high gear, her jaw set, and did not look back again. The northern pass was a treacherous expanse of jagged cliffs and dense, ancient pine forests that separated the autumn crown from the dead zone. Beyond that freezing wasteland lay the Obsidian Keep, the territory of Lycan King Malachi of the Winter Court. He was Alaric's deadliest rival, a warlord known for absolute, freezing precision. To cross into his territory was a death sentence. But Cerys was no longer a citizen of the Autumn Crown. She was a woman with a broken heart, a brilliant mind, and nothing left to lose. Around 3 in the morning, the rain transitioned into a heavy, blinding sleet. The road deteriorated into a muddy, rutted trail. Despite her desperate maneuvering, the rover hit a massive sinkhole. The front axle slammed into the mud with a sickening crunch. The engine whined, then died completely, plunging the forest into absolute silence, save for the wind howling through the canopy. Cerys gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She was miles from the border crossing, stranded in the dead zone. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A primal instinct flared to life. She was not alone. She was being hunted. Cerys did not turn around immediately. She slowly reached into the pocket of her heavy woolen coat, her fingers closing around the cold steel of a compact hunting knife. It was a useless weapon against a werewolf, but holding it kept her grounded. She listened past the howling wind. There was a faint crunch of snow, a low, vibrating hum that resonated directly in her chest. "You are out of your jurisdiction, little bird," a voice rumbled from the shadows of the pines. It was deep, melodic, and entirely devoid of warmth. Cerys turned, clicking on her heavy flashlight. The beam cut through the sleet, illuminating 4 massive wolves. Their fur was matted with ice, their teeth bared in silent, disciplined snarls. They did not attack. They were waiting for a command. Standing behind them was a man wrapped in a tailored black velvet coat that seemed to absorb the meager light of the storm. He had sharp, aristocratic features, skin pale as marble, and eyes the color of a frozen winter sky. A subtle silver chain rested against his dark collar, bearing the crest of the winter court. This was not a mere border patrol. This was Lycan King Malachi. "I have no jurisdiction," Cerys said, her voice remarkably steady, despite the freezing rain lashing against her face and the adrenaline flooding her system. She deliberately kept the flashlight aimed at his chest, not his eyes. It was a sign of respect, but never submission. "I am seeking asylum." Malachi let out a soft, chilling breath that plumed in the freezing air. "Asylum?" he echoed, taking a slow step forward. The massive wolves parted seamlessly to let him through. Alpha King Alaric's most prized pet comes crawling to the winter court in the dead of night, smelling of autumn pine and heartbreak, and expects a warm bed? He loomed over her, towering and broad-shouldered. The scent of ozone, frost, and dark cedar rolled off him, carrying a suffocating alpha aura that would have forced any normal human to their knees. Cerys did not kneel. Her knees locked, her spine straight. Deep within her, something ancient and silent pushed back against his crushing pressure, though she did not know what it was. "Give me one good reason," Malachi murmured, tilting his head. "Why I should not let my vanguard tear you apart and send your bloody coat back to Alaric as a warning." Cerys looked him dead in his pale, unreadable eyes. She did not plead. She did not use her heartbreak as a shield. "Because," Cerys said quietly, "I know the layout of the Southern Autumn and militia. I know their supply routes, their patrol schedules, and the fatal flaw in Alaric's new defensive line." Malachi's faint amusement vanished. The air between them grew impossibly taut. The wolves behind him stopped growling, sensing the sudden shift in their king's demeanor. Deep inside Malachi's chest, his Lycan wolf stirred, not with aggression, but with a sudden sharp fixation on the way the wind carried her scent. It was not just fear and rain. Beneath it was something rare, something like moonflower and cold silver. He masked the reaction instantly. "You would betray your king?" Malachi asked softly. "He is not my king," Cerys replied, the words tasting like ash. "And I am not a pet. I am a strategist. If you take me to the Obsidian Keep, I can give you the Autumn Crown's economy on a silver platter." Malachi studied her face. He searched her dark eyes for a lie, a tremor of weakness, a trap. He found nothing but cold, hardened resolve. The woman standing before him in the freezing mud was entirely broken, yet entirely dangerous. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in a slow, genuinely fascinated smile. He whistled sharply. The wolves backed down, melting into the shadows of the tree line. "You have audacity, strategist," Malachi said, turning his back to her and walking toward the darkness of the pass. "Walk. If you slow down, the cold will claim you before my wolves do." Cerys let out a slow, shaky breath. She slipped the hunting knife back into her pocket and began to walk into the ice. The Obsidian Keep was a monolithic fortress carved directly into the side of a frozen mountain. There was no gold, no silk, no warmth. It was a monument to iron, stone, and survival. Cerys was marched through echoing corridors of black marble, flanked by heavily armed winter court guards. She was shivering violently, her woolen clothes soaked through, her lips a faint shade of blue. Yet she kept her chin elevated. She was a trespasser in a hostile court, but she refused to look like a victim. Heavy iron doors swung open, revealing the War Council chamber. It was a circular room, dominated by a massive table carved from solid slate. A map of the continent was etched into its surface. Around it stood Lycan King Malachi's highest-ranking generals, hard-eyed men and women adorned in furs and dark steel. They fell silent as she walked in. Their hostility was a palpable, crushing force in the room. Malachi stood at the head of the table. He wore no crown, only his tailored black velvet coat, yet he commanded the space effortlessly. He did not offer her a seat nor a change of clothes. He simply gestured to the map. "My generals," Malachi began, his voice smooth and carrying perfectly across the cold stone, "believe that to secure the Silver River Valley, we must send 3 battalions to burn Alaric's outposts. They argue it is the only way to sever the Autumn Crown's supply lines." He turned his dark, fathomless eyes to Cerys. "You claim to know a better way. Prove your worth, string, strategist." "Cerys of the Autumn Crown," a grizzled commander sneered, crossing his massive arms. "A human stray from Alaric's bed. Why are we listening to her?" "Cerys of Nowhere, Commander," she corrected softly. She stepped up to the slate table, acutely aware of the dozen hands resting subtly on sword hilts. She picked up a piece of white chalk. Her fingers were numb, but her grip was absolute. "Burning the outposts will cost you at least 1,000 men in the ensuing skirmishes," Cerys said, her voice steady. She drew a sharp circle around a bend in the Silver River. "Alaric's outposts are heavily fortified, but they are not self-sustaining. They rely entirely on the neutral merchant guilds from the eastern coast to ferry grain and iron upriver. He pays them handsomely, using the tariffs he collects from the Sapphire Port." The room went completely still. "If we attack the ships, we draw the coastal states into the war," a female general countered sharply. "You do not attack the ships," Cerys said, looking up from the board. "You attack the profit margin." She drew a swift, definitive white line connecting the Winter Court mountain passes to the eastern coast. "The guilds use the river because it is fast, but they pay exorbitant docking fees to Alaric. If King Malachi signs a decree subsidizing overland travel through the winter passes, removing all tolls for guild caravans, and offering military escort through the snow, the land route suddenly becomes 30% cheaper than the river route." She set the chalk down. The soft click echoed loudly. "The guilds are loyal to gold, not kings. Within 3 weeks, the river traffic will dry up. Alaric's outposts will starve. He will be forced to reallocate troops from his southern border to guard an empty river simply to save face, weakening his grip on his own rebellion. You choke him out, and it does not cost you a single drop of Winter Court blood." A heavy silence descended on the chamber. The logic was flawless. It was a surgical strike against the Autumn Crown's economy, designed to bypass their superior military strength entirely. "This is a merchant's trick," the grizzled commander barked, slamming his fist onto the stone. "We are Lycans. Wars are won with claws and steel, not ledgers." He took a menacing step toward Cerys, his hand drawing his blade an inch from its scabbard. Before the metal could fully sing, the temperature in the room plummeted. The blue flames in the braziers flared wildly. Malachi did not raise his voice. He did not even move his hands. He simply unleashed a fraction of his alpha aura, directing it entirely at the commander. The massive werewolf gasped, his knees buckling under the invisible, crushing weight of his king's authority. He hit the stone floor with a dull thud. "Kingdoms are won with ledgers, Commander," Malachi whispered. His voice was ice. "Put your blade away before I take you, our hand, with it." The commander scrambled backward, bowing his head in absolute submission. Malachi stepped away from the head of the table, closing the distance between himself and Cerys. He looked down at her. She had not flinched when the blade was drawn. She had not stepped back. "Draft the decree," Malachi commanded the room, never breaking eye contact with Cerys. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur meant only for her ears. The scent of dark cedar washed over her. "You have earned your keep, Cerys," he said softly, but as his Lycan senses brushed against her shivering frame, his eyes narrowed a fraction of an inch. Beneath the smell of the rain and her exhaustion, there was a faint, dormant pulse of silver magic, a scent that belonged to a bloodline long thought dead. She was not just a human strategist, and Malachi was going to find out exactly what she was hiding. The chamber they provided her was stark, practical, and blessedly warm. A roaring fire crackled in the heavy stone hearth, chasing the residual ice from Cerys's bones. She had traded her soaked, mud-stained riding clothes for the garments provided by the winter court servants, a high-collared gown of thick, midnight blue wool, cinched with a dark leather belt. It lacked the gold embroidery and ostentatious display of the autumn crown, but it suited her perfectly. She sat at a massive ironwood desk, a fresh sheet of parchment laid out before her. To her right, resting silently against the dark wood, was the gold royal Lee key. She had kept it not out of sentiment, but as a compass. Every time her mind flickered to the image of Alaric and Isolde in the study, she looked at the key, and the pain instantly hardened into surgical focus. The heavy iron door creaked open without a knock. Elder Vane, a towering werewolf with graying fur woven into his braids, stepped into the room. He was one of Malachi's highest-ranking counselors, and his pale eyes radiated pure suspicion. "The king is a tactical genius," Vane rasped, closing the door behind him. "But he is letting his curiosity blind him. I have reviewed your so-called strategy, human." Cerys did not look up from her parchment. Her quill continued to scratch methodically across the page. "And what did you find, Elder Vane?" "A trap," Vane snarled, stepping closer to the desk, his massive hands resting on the edge. "You remove the tolls for the guilds, you drain the Winter Court's treasury to protect their caravans, and then Alaric's southern militia ambushes us in the passes while we are distracted. You are a spy for the Autumn Crown." "If I wanted to trap you, Elder," Cerys said, finally setting her quill down, her dark eyes meeting his without a shred of fear, "I would not use the guilds. I would have advised King Malachi to march directly on the Silver River outposts and let the harsh winter wipe out your infantry." Vane bared his teeth, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "You speak with too much arrogance for a stray. I should have you locked in the ice cells until—" "Until what, Vane?" The voice was soft, but it hit the room with the concussive force of an avalanche. Elder Vane froze. The shadow of Lycan King Malachi filled the doorway. He stepped into the chamber, the sheer weight of his alpha aura instantly suffocating the air in the room. Vane immediately dropped his gaze, taking a hasty step back from Cerys's desk. "My king," Vane stammered, "I was merely interrogating the prisoner. She cannot be trusted. Her blood smells of the south." "She is not a prisoner," Malachi corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "She is the architect of our victory, and you are interrupting her work. Leave us." Vane swallowed hard, bowing his head in submission. "Yes, sire." He hurried out of the room, the heavy iron door clicking shut behind him. The suffocating tension dissipated the moment they were alone. Malachi walked slowly toward the desk. Cerys watched him, her spine straight. As he drew near, the scent of dark cedar and frost enveloped her. Strangely, it did not make her want to shrink away. Instead, the silent, dormant energy inside her veins seemed to calm. For Malachi, the reaction was even more profound. The Lycan inside him, a beast built for war and bloodshed, went completely still. It did not want to dominate the woman sitting at the desk. It wanted to stand behind her chair and guard the door. He forced his mind to remain sharp, focusing on the parchment. "Is it finished?" Malachi asked, his voice losing its chilling edge. "It is," Cerys replied. She slid the parchment across the desk. "The Frost Tariff Decree. It legally abolishes all mountain tolls for the Eastern guilds and guarantees them safe passage. The moment they receive this, they will reroute their entire supply chain away from the Autumn Crown." Malachi picked up the parchment. His eyes scanned the precise, elegant handwriting. It was not just a decree. It was a masterpiece of legal and economic warfare. It left absolutely no loopholes for Alaric to exploit. He looked down at Cerys, his pale eyes lingering on the golden key resting on her desk. He understood exactly what it meant. She was burning her past to the ground. Malachi reached into his coat and produced a stick of black sealing wax. He melted it over the candle on her desk, letting the dark wax pool at the bottom of the decree. With absolute finality, he pressed his heavy iron signet ring into the wax, leaving the crest of the Winter Court.
Brilliant.
"Send the ravens," Malachi murmured, looking back into her eyes. "Let us see how the great Alpha King of the Autumn Crown likes starvation." The silence in the Autumn Crown was no longer peaceful. It was the suffocating silence of a dying kingdom. Exactly 21 days had passed since the night of the storm. Alpha King Alaric stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his royal study, staring blindly out at the sun-drenched inn gardens. The heavy oak doors were closed, but they could not block out the mounting panic spreading through the palace corridors. On his massive mahogany desk sat a pile of unread ledgers. They were useless to him. The numbers, trade routes, and treasury logs were all written in a complex cipher, a system Cerys had invented to protect the kingdom's wealth. Without her mind, the books were nothing but gibberish. "Alaric, darling, you have to speak to the steward." The sweet, whining voice shattered his concentration. Isolde lounged on the leather sofa, twirling a strand of her golden hair. She wore a stunning crimson gown, radiant and completely unbothered by the heavy atmosphere of the room. "Not now, Isolde," Alaric grunted, rubbing his temples. A vicious, throbbing headache had been gnawing at him for days. "But you must," she pouted, standing up and wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "The cooks are saying there is no refined sugar for the pastries today, and the seamstress cannot finish my gown for the Equinox Gala because the Eastern silk shipments are stalled. Cerys used to handle this. You need to hire someone to fix her mess." Alaric turned sharply, his amber eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous fire. The sheer, breathtaking ignorance of the woman standing before him hit him like a physical blow. Before he could speak, the heavy oak doors burst open. Kale strode in, bypassing Kur protocol entirely. The towering Beta's face was grim, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He carried a stack of dispatches, clutching them so tightly the parchment was crumpled. "We have a crisis," Kale said, his voice flat, ignoring Isolde's presence entirely. Alaric straightened. "The Southern Rebellion?" "No," Kale replied. "The Silver River." He tossed the dispatches onto the mahogany desk. They landed right on top of the indecipherable ledgers. "The merchant guilds have suspended all river traffic. Our outposts are completely cut off. Commander Thorne reports they have enough grain for 4 days. After that, the soldiers starve. The minor packs on the border are already threatening mutiny." Alaric crossed the room in 3 long strides, snatching the top letter. "Suspended? Under whose authority? We have a standing treaty with the guilds." "They invoked the profitability clause," Kale said, his tone terrifyingly quiet. "King Malachi of the Winter Court just abolished all mountain tolls and offered free Lycan military escorts for overland caravans. The guilds have rerouted their entire supply chain through the north. We are holding an empty river, Alaric." Alaric stared at the parchment, the words blurring together. The strategy was flawless. It was non-aggressive, perfectly legal, and entirely devastating. It was a surgical strike against the Autumn Crown's economy, designed to bypass their superior military strength. His blood turned to ice. He looked up at Kale. The Beta was staring back at him, and in his dark eyes, Alaric saw the exact same horrifying realization. King Malachi was a warlord of ice and steel. He did not draft economic subsidies. He did not read guild treaties to find diplomatic loopholes. "No," Alaric whispered, taking a step back as if the desk itself had burned him. "The Northern Guard patrols reported a blind spot breached 3 weeks ago," Kale said, his voice devoid of any comfort. "The night she left, tire tracks leading into the dead zone, heading right toward the Obsidian Keep." "She would not," Alaric said, his voice shaking. His inner wolf clawed against his ribs, howling in sudden, blinding panic. "She would not go to him. Malachi would kill her on sight." "Malachi did not kill her, Alaric," Kale replied, pointing a heavy finger at the economic decree. "He hired her. You gave our greatest enemy the architect of our kingdom." "Alaric, what does this mean?" Isolde interrupted, stepping forward with a confused frown. "If the river is empty, how do I get my silk?" The room went dead silent. Kale stared at the false Luna as if she had just grown a second head. Alaric slowly turned to look at the golden-haired woman, the ghost of his youth, the woman he had thought he needed to secure a military alliance. He looked at her pouting lips and her empty, demanding eyes, and a wave of profound, nauseating clarity washed over him. She was a hollow ornament. And for this ornament, he had thrown away the queen who held the foundation of his world. Get out, Alaric whispered. Excuse me? Isolde blinked. Get out! Alaric roared, the sound tearing from his chest with the concussive force of an alpha's command. The glass in the windows rattled. Isolde shrieked, stumbling backward into the corridor, her face pale with terror. Alaric turned back to Cale, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic light. His pride was shattered, replaced by the terrifying reality of his own hubris. "Saddle your fastest horse, Cale," Alaric ordered, his voice trembling. "Ride into the dead zone. Request a parley with the Winter Court." "Alaric, we cannot afford to pay the northern tariffs to get the trade back," Cale warned. "I do not care about the tariffs," Alaric breathed, staring at the empty space on his desk. "Tell Malachi I will pay whatever he wants. Just tell him I want her back." The great hall of the Obsidian Keep was a cavernous expanse of black marble and vaulted arches. Today, the usually stark room was lined with heavily armed Winter Court guards, the braziers burning with a mesmerizing pale blue fire. Beta Cale was escorted through the heavy iron doors. He looked terrible. His thick woolen coat was caked in ice and mud from a relentless, brutal ride through the dead zone. Yet he stood tall, his jaw set with the stubborn pride of an autumn crown wolf in enemy territory. As he reached the base of the dais, his eyes shifted from the imposing, terrifying figure of Lycan King Malachi sitting upon the steel throne to the woman standing directly to his right. The breath caught in Cale's throat. This was not the shivering, heartbroken woman who had fled the southern estate in a rusted vehicle. Cerys wore a gown of deep, midnight blue velvet, her dark hair braided sharply against her scalp. She stood in the heart of the enemy stronghold, not as a prisoner, but as a predator in her own right. "To what do I owe this breach of my borders, Beta Cale?" Malachi spoke, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. It dripped with aristocratic disdain. "Has Alaric come to surrender his empty river?" Cale tore his gaze away from Cerys and focused on the Lycan King. "I bring terms from Alpha King Alaric. The economic blockade on the Silver River is an act of veiled aggression. If the Frost Tariff Decree is not repealed, the Autumn Crown will consider it an act of war." A low murmur rippled through the Winter Court lords. A war with the South was not to be taken lightly. Malachi, however, did not even blink. He leaned back in his throne, seemingly bored. "Is that so?" "Cale," Cerys said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a silver blade. The murmuring stopped instantly. Cale flinched. "Cerys," he breathed, a look of desperate relief flashing across his exhausted face. "Please, you have to stop this. You know what he is doing. You know Alaric will tear this continent apart to get you back." "Alaric will do no such thing," Cerys replied, her tone perfectly even, devoid of any warmth. "He is currently facing a total collapse of his southern border. His troops in the outposts have been on half rations for 4 days. The minor packs are withholding their tithes because the trade routes are frozen. He cannot afford to march north." Cale stared at her, horrified. "How do you know that?" "Because I designed the autumn supply chain, Cale," she said, stepping forward, leaving the shadow of Malachi's throne. "And I know exactly how long it takes to starve it out." "You are killing us, Cerys," Cale whispered, his voice cracking, stepping toward the dais. "The people you protected, the kingdom you built. Alaric made a mistake, but he loves you." As Kale took another step forward, the temperature in the room dropped instantly. A low, terrifying growl resonated from Malachi's chest. The Lycan King did not stand, but his alpha aura slammed into Kale like a physical wall of ice, forcing the beta to a sudden halt. "You step too close to my chief strategist, beta," Malachi warned, his eyes flashing a dangerous, glowing silver. "Address her with the respect she has earned, or you will not leave this hall with your tongue." Kale swallowed hard, paralyzed by the sheer dominance of the Winter King. He looked back at Cerys, pleading with his eyes. "I protected a king who repaid my loyalty with betrayal," Cerys said coldly, unaffected by the suffocating tension in the room. "I am merely showing him the true foundation of his power. He thought I was an accessory. I am showing him what happens when the accessory stops functioning." She looked down at the envoy from her past, her dark eyes entirely dry. "Go back to the Autumn Crown, Kale. Tell Alaric the decree stands. If he wants the river traffic restored, he can pay the winter court tariffs, 50% on all grain and iron passing through the north." 50%? Kale gasped. "That will bankrupt the crown in a month." "Then he will starve," Malachi interjected smoothly, finally standing up from his throne. His presence was a looming, icy mountain beside her. "You have your answer, Beta. Escort him back to the border." As the guard seized Kale's arms, the Beta locked eyes with Cerys one last time. "He is on his knees, Cerys," Kale said softly. "Let him stay there," Cerys replied, turning her back on him. The heavy iron doors of the great hall closed, sealing Beta Kale out of the obsidian keep. The silence that followed was absolute. Cerys stood at the base of the dais, her posture impeccably straight, but the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was beginning to recede. She had just condemned the kingdom she spent 3 years building to starvation. It was a flawless tactical maneuver, yet the sheer weight of it pressed heavily against her ribs. Malachi watched her from the steps of the throne. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, the subtle tightening of her jaw. He did not offer her empty platitudes. He understood the burden of command better than anyone. "Walk with me," Malachi said softly. He led her away from the braziers, down a shadowed corridor that opened into the keep's inner courtyard. The freezing air rushed in, biting at Cerys's exposed neck, but the biting cold was a welcome distraction. The courtyard was open to the night sky, where a massive, fractured moon hung over the jagged peaks. In the center of the courtyard sat the Moonstone altar. It was an ancient, circular slab of white stone, cracked with age and veined with frost. It was a sacred relic of the Winter Court, a monument that legend said only responded to the true sovereign bloodlines of the Wolf Kingdoms. Cerys stepped toward it, drawn by a strange, humming vibration in the air. "You did what was necessary, Cerys," Malachi said, standing a respectful distance behind her. His voice was a low, grounding rumble against the howling wind. "Alaric chose a hollow crown over the architect of his empire. The consequence is his to bear, not yours." "I know," Cerys whispered. She reached out, her numb fingers lightly brushing the snow off the edge of the altar. "But it does not mean the ashes do not burn when they fall." To steady herself, she rested her bare palm flat against the cracked white stone. The reaction was instantaneous. A pulse of pure, blinding silver light erupted from the exact point where her skin touched the stone. The frost instantly melted away. The silver light raced along the ancient cracks, illuminating the courtyard with an ethereal, moonlit glow. Cerys gasped, trying to pull her hand back, but the magic was not hurting her. It felt like a deep, sudden exhale after years of holding her breath, the suffocating tightness in her chest, the invisible seal that had kept her dormant all her life, shattered. The scent of ozone and rain vanished, replaced by a breathtakingly sharp fragrance of night-blooming moonflower and cold silver. Behind her, the Lycan King froze. Malachi's eyes widened, the dark irises bleeding into a glowing, luminescent silver. The beast inside him, the ruthless apex predator that terrified the northern continent, went entirely still. It did not want to hunt. It did not want to conquer. It recognized the sovereign magic radiating from the woman touching the altar. She was not just a human strategist. The blood of the ancient lost silver moonline ran through her veins. And the mate bond, which his wolf had only quietly suspected, now locked into place with the force of a tectonic shift. The guards stationed at the perimeter of the courtyard fell to their knees instantly, their heads bowed in absolute reverence to the glowing stone and the woman standing before it. Cerys looked down at her glowing hands, her breath hitching. "What is this?" Malachi stepped into the silver light. He did not order her to kneel. He did not try to possess the power she had just unlocked. He stopped beside her, his massive frame shielding her from the harsh wind. "It is the truth," Malachi murmured, his voice thick with an emotion the Winter King rarely showed. "Awe. The autumn crown kept you in a study to balance their gold, completely blind to the fact that they were harboring a queen." He slowly reached out, his large, calloused hand gently hovering over hers on the stone, never forcing contact. It was an offer of protection, an acknowledgement of absolute equality. "The stone does not lie, Cerys," Malachi said softly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You belong to the ice." Miles away, the storm was tearing the continent apart. The heavy gates of the Autumn Crown estate swung open. Alpha King Alaric, devoid of his royal armor, wearing only a heavy traveling cloak, kicked his black warhorse into a frantic gallop. The cold wind whipped his face, but he felt nothing. His chest was hollow, his wolf howling in an agony of his own making. He rode straight into the blinding blizzard of the dead zone, leaving his crumbling kingdom behind, desperate to find the woman he had thrown away. The wind in the dead zone did not just blow, it screamed. Alpha King Alaric spurred his massive black warhorse forward, driving the beast into the blinding whiteout of the northern pass. The snow was falling so thick it felt like riding through a wall of crushing, freezing iron. Alaric wore no royal armor, only a heavy fur-lined traveling cloak over his tunic. The biting cold gnawed at his exposed skin, freezing the moisture in his breath, but the physical agony barely registered. It was nothing compared to the hollow, tearing pain in his chest. Hours earlier, the Autumn Crown had descended into chaos. The council lords were screaming about bankruptcies and empty grain silos. The southern militias were threatening to march on the capital. Amidst the deafening panic, Isolde had clung to his arm, crying hysterically about her ruined gala and begging him to punish the merchants. In that single chaotic moment, the illusion had shattered completely. Alaric had looked at Isolde, the woman he thought he had mourned, the woman whose return he thought would validate his ego, and felt absolutely nothing. No spark, no tether, just a profound, sickening emptiness. He had torn his arm away from her, ignored the shouting of his generals, and walked out into the storm. Now, surrounded by the merciless ice of the dead zone, the memory of Cerys hit him with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the quiet scrape of her quill in the royal study late at night. He remembered how she never flinched when his temper flared, how her calm, steady presence had always grounded his volatile fire. He remembered the sharp, piercing chime of the gold royal ledger key hitting the marble floor. It was not just a key she had dropped. It was his entire kingdom. It was his heart, and he had been too arrogant, too blinded by his own pride to realize it until she was gone. "Faster," Alaric grunted, his voice a raspy bark as he kicked the horse's flanks. His inner wolf was clawing frantically at the cage of his ribs, howling a song of absolute grief. The beast knew what the man had refused to see. Cerys was not just a human strategist. She was the anchor of his soul, and he had driven her directly into the territory of a warlord who would not hesitate to kill him on sight. The sleet turned into heavy, packing snow as the elevation rose. The temperature plummeted to a lethal degree. Alaric's auburn hair was caked in ice, his fingers numb around the leather reins. He was an Alpha King of the South, born of sun and fire, entirely unequipped for the brutal, unforgiving domain of the Winter Court. Suddenly, his warhorse stumbled. The beast let out a breathless, agonizing whinny as its front hooves broke through a hidden crust of ice, plunging deep into a snowdrift. The sudden stop launched Alaric over the horse's neck. He hit the frozen earth hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He rolled through the snow, coming to a halt at the base of a jagged black rock formation. Alaric groaned, forcing himself onto his hands and knees. He spat a mouthful of blood and snow, his limbs trembling violently from the freezing cold. He looked back. His horse was on its side, panting heavily, unable to stand. It had given everything it had. "No," Alaric breathed, his voice cracking. "Not here. Not yet." He forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lead, his boots sinking knee-deep into the snow with every step. The wind howled, mocking his desperation. He had conquered armies, he had bent minor alphas to his will. Yet here, in the freezing dark, his physical dominance meant absolutely nothing. He trudged forward, his vision blurring. He did not know how long he walked. Minutes bled into hours. The cold was actively shutting down his body, the fire of his alpha blood flickering dangerously low. Just as his knees began to buckle, the wind suddenly shifted. Through the blinding whiteout, a massive monolithic shadow loomed. It was the outer wall of the obsidian keep. Alaric stumbled forward, reaching out a trembling hand toward the dark stone. Before his fingers could brush the wall, the snow in front of him seemed to part. A low, vibrating growl echoed through the storm. 4 massive Lycan wolves, their fur perfectly blending with the shadows and the ice, stepped out of the whiteout. They formed a semicircle, their pale, glowing eyes locked onto the fallen king. Alaric dropped to his knees, utterly exhausted, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He looked up, his amber eyes bloodshot and hollow. Standing behind the vanguard of wolves were 2 figures. One was Lycan King Malachi, towering and absolute, wrapped in his dark velvet coat, looking down at Alaric with an expression of freezing disdain. And standing beside him, completely untouched by the storm, was Cerys. The blizzard screamed around them, a chaotic vortex of white and gray. Yet the space immediately surrounding Cerys and Malachi was eerily still. Alpha King Alaric knelt in the deep snow, his heavy traveling cloak caked in ice. He was shivering violently, his breath coming in ragged, painful clouds. He looked up, his amber eyes bloodshot and desperate, locking onto the woman standing before him. Cerys wore a heavy cloak of midnight blue velvet lined with silver fox fur. The biting wind did not seem to touch her. Since the Moonstone altar had awakened her bloodline, an intrinsic warmth radiated from her skin, melting the snowflakes before they could even land on her shoulders. She looked majestic. She looked untouchable. Cerys, Alaric rasped. His voice was a broken, grating sound, stripped of all its usual dominating fire. He forced himself forward, dragging his knees through the snow, closing the distance until he was only 10 paces away. The massive Lycan wolves flanking Malachi bared their teeth, stepping forward, but Malachi raised a single, black-gloved hand. The wolves instantly held their ground. "You requested a parley, King Alaric," Cerys spoke first. Her voice carried over the howling wind, cold, professional, and entirely devoid of pity. "Speak your terms." Alaric winced as if she had struck him across the face. "My terms are you," Alaric choked out, his chest heaving. He ignored the terrifying Lycan King standing right beside her. His entire universe had narrowed down to the dark eyes of the woman he had betrayed. "I was a fool, Cerys. I was arrogant and I was blind. I broke the best thing that ever happened to me." Cerys did not blink. She looked down at him, her expression a mask of glacial ice. "Isolde is gone," Alaric continued, his words spilling out in a frantic rush. "I banished her. She means nothing to me. I need you, Cerys. The kingdom needs you. Please, just come home." "State your economic terms regarding the frost tariff, Alaric," Cerys repeated, her tone unchanging. "Damn the tariffs!" Alaric roared, the sudden burst of emotion causing him to cough violently, spitting a spray of blood onto the pristine snow. "I will give you anything, half the treasury, a seat on the High Council. I will crown you Queen of the Autumn Crown tomorrow. Just come back to me." For a fleeting second, Alaric searched her dark eyes for a flicker of the warmth she used to reserve only for him. He searched for the woman who used to read by the fire in his study, the woman who had quietly solved his empire's greatest crises. He found nothing but the abyss. "I am home, Alaric," Cerys said softly. The words hit him harder than the freezing wind. Alaric recoiled, shaking his head frantically. "You do not belong here," Alaric pleaded, gesturing weakly toward the towering black fortress. "You do not belong with him. He is a warlord, Cerys. He is using your anger to destroy me." "He respects me," Cerys countered, her voice finally rising slightly, cutting through the storm like a silver blade. "He saw my mind before he ever saw my face. You kept me hidden in your study to clean up your messes so you could play the great warrior. King Malachi brought me to his war council to conquer a continent." She took a single step closer to the kneeling king, her aura suddenly flaring, a subtle, crushing weight of sovereign dignity that made Alaric's own wolf whimper in its cage. "You do not love me, Alaric," Cerys whispered, the absolute certainty in her voice echoing in the cold air. "You loved how easy I made it for you to be a king, and now that it is hard, you want your tool back. I am no longer available." Desperation clawed at Alaric's throat. He lunged forward, trying to reach the hem of her velvet cloak. "Cerys, please." Before his freezing fingers could graze the fabric, the ground beneath him seemed to shatter. Lycan King Malachi moved with terrifying preternatural speed. He stepped directly between Alaric and Cerys. He did not draw a weapon. He simply unleashed the full, suffocating weight of his alpha aura. It hit Alaric like a collapsing mountain. The Autumn King was slammed face first into the snow, his body paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated dominance of the Winter King. He gasped for air, his muscles locking, unable to lift his head. "You misunderstand the situation, Kaelin," Malachi purred, his voice a dark, vibrating rumble that shook the frozen earth. "She does not want a seat on your council, and if you attempt to touch my queen again, I will leave your head on a pike at the border." Alaric lay in the snow, broken, humiliated, and utterly defeated. He listened to the heavy, synchronized sound of the Winter Court guards turning around. "The parley is over," Cerys said, her voice fading into the storm. "Pay the tariffs, Alaric, or prepare to lose the south." The heavy iron gates of the Obsidian Keep groaned open, then slammed shut with a deafening final boom. Alaric was left alone in the howling darkness of the dead zone, the snow quickly burying the tears freezing on his cheeks. The heavy iron doors of the Obsidian Keep sealed the storm outside. As the resounding boom faded into the stone architecture, a profound, unbroken silence led over the corridor. Cerys stood just inside the gates, listening to the muffled howling of the wind. Out there, in the freezing dark, Alpha King Alaric was crawling back to a ruined empire, carrying nothing but the heavy, suffocating weight of his own regret. It was over. The phantom ache in her chest, the residual tether to the man she had spent 3 years building a kingdom for, finally evaporated into the cold northern air. Malachi stood beside her. He did not rush her. The terrifying Lycan King, whose very name made the southern continent tremble, simply waited in the shadows, allowing her the time to breathe. "Do you mourn it?" Malachi asked quietly, his pale eyes studying her profile in the dim torchlight. Cerys turned to him. The silver warmth of her awakened moonblood still hummed faintly beneath her skin. "I mourn the time I wasted," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "But I do not mourn the man." A slow, genuine smile curved Malachi's lips. He extended his arm toward her, not as a command, but as an offering. Cerys rested her hand lightly on his forearm. Through the heavy black velvet, his arm felt like forged iron, an unbreakable foundation. Together, they walked back into the great hall. The vast, cavernous room was no longer empty. The entire Winter Court had assembled. Generals, council elders, and high-ranking Lycans stood in perfectly disciplined ranks along the black marble floor. The pale blue fire in the braziers cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. As Malachi and Cerys entered, a collective hush fell over the room. Elder Vane, the very wolf who had once accused Cerys of being a southern spy, stood at the front of the assembly. He looked at the woman walking beside his king. He felt the subtle, ancient resonance of the silver moonline radiating from her, and he saw the flawless, surgical victory she had just handed to the Winter Court without spilling a single drop of Lycan blood. Slowly, deliberately, Elder Vane dropped to one knee, bowing his massive head. It was a cascade. One by one, the hardened warriors and proud nobles of the Winter Court knelt upon the stone floor. The rhythmic thud of their knees hitting the marble echoed through the vaulted arches. They were not bowing out of fear of their king. They were bowing in genuine reverence to the brilliant mind and the awakened bloodline of the woman who had saved them from a bloody war. Cerys stopped at the base of the dais. She looked out at the sea of kneeling wolves. She remembered the day she was forced to stand in Alaric's sunlit study, cast aside like a broken tool so a false Luna could take her place. She remembered the mocking whispers of the autumn court. They had called her a pet. They had called her weak. She looked at the kneeling court of ice and iron, and she knew she would never be weak again. Malachi stepped up to the steel throne, but he did not sit. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a heavy, intricately carved silver ring, the master cipher of the North, the absolute key to the Winter Court's treasury and military supply lines. He walked back down the steps and stopped in front of Cerys. "Alaric gave you a desk in the shadows to clean up his messes," Malachi said, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the silent, kneeling court. "I do not want you in the shadows, Cerys. The Winter Court does not need a grounding wire." He gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, sending a jolt of electric, grounding warmth straight to her heart. The mate bond, undeniably real and terrifyingly powerful, sang between them. "We need a queen," Malachi finished. He slid the heavy silver ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, cold and absolute, replacing the ghost of the gold key she had left behind. Cerys looked up into his pale, winter sky eyes. She saw no arrogance, no fragile ego demanding to be coddled. She saw a true Alpha King, a ruler who was secure enough in his own terrifying power to hand the keys of his empire to a woman whose intellect matched his own. She tightened her grip on his hand, her dark eyes reflecting the blue flames of the hall. "Then let us rule the North," Cerys whispered. And as the Winter Court rose to their feet to roar their approval for their new queen, the autumn crowns starved in the dark, learning too late that a kingdom is only as powerful as the woman who holds its foundation. A crown can be stolen, but a true bond and a brilliant mind cannot be buried forever. What moment proved to you that Cerys was the true queen of the North? If this story of strategic vengeance, public justice, and a truly protective Lycan King touched your heart, subscribe and stay with us for the next tale.